If you saw a trembling old man beside a cold cup of coffee, wrapped in a tattered scarf and jeered at by a group of students, would you stand up? A Navy SEAL did just that, not out of pity, but because he recognized something no one dared believe, a forbidden tattoo, one that appears only on missions the Pentagon denies. So, who was that man? And why does all of America owe him an apology? This story will make you rethink every glance you've ever brushed off on the street. All right, my dear viewers, get ready for a tale that will leave you speechless. Take a second to like the video and subscribe, and drop a comment below to let me know where you're watching from and what time it is for you. It's always thrilling to see people joining us from all corners of the globe. His name was Eldon Parrish. And if you lived in Missoula long enough, you'd see him like a faint scratch on the morning window there, blurred, but no one bothered to wipe it away. No one really paid attention. He troubled no one, asked for nothing, didn't demand anyone remember his name. Every morning, he would quietly step into the cafe on the corner of Higgins Avenue, wearing a threadbare plaid scarf loosely draped around his neck. That piece of cloth had once been a deep crimson, now it was as faded as ash. No one would recognize what it had been. That scarf, somehow, was the only thing he guarded with care. Everything else, his memories, his status, his name had drifted away or been torn from him as if they never truly belonged. But the scarf remained, as though he could not set foot on the street without it, as if it were some unseen limb. The morning barista knew him so well she no longer gave him a second thought. She would pour a cup of black coffee, no sugar, and set it down in the exact spot at the corner table. No greeting, no questions. Eldon would note a motion not of thanks, but of ritual survival, and then sit, hands cupping the mug in a gesture almost religious, as if praying to a silent god. He'd stay there for hours. He read no newspapers, wrote nothing, checked no phone because he didn't have one. He simply sat. His eyes followed the dusty light slanting through the window, tracking how time drifted across the wooden floorboards like waves over sand. No one knew what he was thinking, no one asked, and he had no intention of answering. Patrons came to regard him as part of the cafe's decor, like the worn shelf against the wall or the faded map of Montana hanging in the corner. Some called him the coffee old man. Others didn't even recall seeing him, though he sat there day after day, season after season. Then, one Thursday morning, no different from any other, except for an ill-timed LAFA group of students from the university across the river burst in, boisterous and busy, heedless of anyone else. Spotting Eldon in his usual seat, a blonde-haired student with headphones slung around his neck sneered, "That old guy again," probably pretending to be homeless for sympathy. His comment wasn't loud, but it was enough to set their table roaring with laughter, youthful, sharp, innocent in its cruelty. Eldon didn't look up, yet his hand tightened around his coffee cup, a small squeeze, as if holding on to something slipping away. Then, slowly, he touched the scarf at his throat knot, adjusting it. Not rewrapping it, just touching it, as though verifying it was still there. No one noticed. No one paid attention to how his shoulders sagged, how his gaze drifted from the window to the empty space on the tabletop. No one apologized, no one looked back. And the conversation moved on again about spring break, final exams, who had just been cancelled online. Eldon became a fixture once more, a smudge on the glass, a chair that was always occupied by someone no one bothered to name. But he stayed. Not because he had nowhere else to go, but because he had nowhere else to be himself. In Eldon's world, that tattered scarf was the sole keeper of truth. It had once belonged to someone else, person who was gone. And he sat here each morning as guardian of that fading memory, reminding himself who he'd been, what he'd done, and why silence was his only means of survival. No one knew that. No one ever asked. Because in a world where everything must be proven with records, social media, and QR codes, Eldon Parrish was an inconvenience, a question no one had the patience to hear answered. He took a sip of his cold coffee. No wince, no reaction. It didn't need to be hotly real, just like him. A former soldier, a soul striving in vain to keep a name from disappearing, in silence, in invisibility. All that remained was the scarf threadbare, worn, yet preserved like the final piece of evidence in a life everyone had forgotten. One morning was no different from the others. Eldon still sat there, quietly, the faded plaid scarf loosely wrapped around his neck, a cup of coffee neatly placed before him, his hand trembling just enough to betray the slightest quiver yet not spilling a drop. Everything remained unchanged until he stood up to pour himself a refill. The motion was familiar, but this time his sleeve slipped back, and in that instant, a tattoo was reveal-distinct jet black though blurred by time, yet unmistakable. An arrow piercing through two interlocking circles. Only one person in the cafe noticed, Chris Landon. He didn't know why he looked up at that precise moment. Perhaps it was the soft footstep of Eldon, or an unnameable intuition. But when his gaze fell on that tattoo, time in his mind came to an immediate halt. It wasn't an ordinary wartime marking, not a SEAL insignia, not a Ranger emblem, not a Special Ops badge. It belonged to something Elsene operation he'd only ever glimpsed in a document withdrawn 24 hours after release. Something he was forbidden to ask about, and which no one ever spoke of again even in the Pentagon's darkest chambers, Revenant. Chris felt his chest tighten, not from fear, but from disbelief. Not disbelief in Eldon, but in everything he'd been told to believe, that men like Eldon didn't exist, that operations like Revenant were mere ghosts on paper. And so he stood. He didn't call out, no fanfare, no rush. He simply walked toward Eldon, step by deliberate step, as though approaching something both perilous and sacred. Eldon didn't notice. He continued pouring his coffee, hand still trembling but resolute, the gesture of a man who had performed it all his life. Chris stopped directly in front of him. He stood tall, eyes fixed on the exposed tattoo peeking from beneath the sleeve. Then he raised his hand. A military salute, neither perfunctory nor polite, but the salute of one soldier offering respect to another whom he believed had saved lives with his own body. Eldon froze. His hand paused midair. The cup tilted slightly before settling upright once more. He didn't look up right away. But he felt it, not a glance, but something quieter, a weight, a presence he'd known well, one he'd carried on his shoulders for years, recognition from someone who understood. Then he lifted his head. Their eyes met. No words were spoken, none were needed. In that shared gaze was a language no one else could hear. The language of survivors. Of those who'd seen what no one ought to see. Who'd lived through a moment when a single misstep could end everything. Chris needed no confirmation. He'd seen enough. He stepped back, lowered his hand, and dipped his head slightly, as if withdrawing from a hallowed space. No introduction, no names exchanged. For what he'd just witnessed said it all. Eldon did not immediately return to his table. He stood there for several seconds, watching the young soldier's silhouette recede, and for the first time in years, he did not feel completely invisible. Not because someone had seen the tattoo, but because that someone knew what it meant, and chose to bow his head rather than ask questions. He returned to his seat, tugged his sleeve down, unhurried, unrevealing, simply a calm gesture as if closing a door that had remained open far too long. He adjusted the plaid scarf around his neck, not out of reflex, but as a silent salute to something newly rekindled. As for Chris, his hand rested on the edge of the table, his heart still pounding, but his eyes transformed. Something within him had been both challenged and affirmed. He didn't understand why Eldon still lived, or why he sat here every morning. But he knew one thing. This man was no failure. He could not be with that tattoo. And as Chris left the cafe, a simple question echoed in his mind. If that man had belonged to an operation erased from every map, and he had just saluted a forgotten legend, then what had happened? And why did everyone remain silent? In 2009, Eldon Parrish was no longer a name. In the operational files, he was referred to by an abbreviated code bearing no relation to his background or rank. For special operators like him, names were merely burdens. In the arid Helmand Hills where every valley was a death trap served in Reaction Team 9, a unit so secretive that even logistics officers weren't sure it existed. They bore no insignia, wore no name tags, no unit designation, no badge, no official record, only 6 faces that read one another in silence, communicating by glance and reflex, 6 skill sets, 6 pieces assembled to accomplish a task no one else would accept. To detect and neutralize a vast network of improvised minds and standardized, ever-shifting, always one step ahead of U.S. Army clearance technology. In Helmand, death did not come from gunfire, it came from the ground. Every footprint could be the end. Every stone, every patch of grass could conceal a detonator. Their mission was to outpace death, read terrain by instinct, sense traps by sound, survive by gut. That night, the fog lay thick as a shroud. Team 9 had just finished 2 days of continuous operations, sleeping in rotating shifts within a narrow gorge. The first sound was not gunfire but the clink of metal on metal. A second later, a flash of light. The enemy had been waiting. The team leader was hit in the opening seconds. No time to shout, no time to give orders, only a final look. Cold, clear, and as cutting as a blade directed at Eldon. Then he collapsed without a sound. In that moment, Eldon did not think, he acted, instantly. He crawled forward, dragging 2 pinned-down soldiers from beneath a rock ledge, signaled the sniper to fall back to higher ground. The medic had taken a leg wound. Eldon hoisted him onto his back, plodding slowly over the scree-strewn slope where no one knew how many mines lay in wait. Bullets whizzed overhead from 3 directions, but he did not stop. A round tore through his shoulder. He staggered but pressed on. Then shrapnel ripped into his hip. He gritted his teeth, no cry, no collapse. The young soldier on his back was still alive. When they reached the rally point, his blood flowed so freely his boots squelched. But he refused to let anyone dress his wounds until he counted every man, every name, every injury. The remaining 4 were all alive. It was a success but also a sentence. Back at base, there was no reception, no questions, no debrief, only a terse order, honorable discharge, no appeals, no reasons. Eldon's name vanished from the network, his access card was deactivated, his inbox wiped clean. All records of Team 9 were purged overnight. A commanding officer had submitted Eldon's nomination for the Medal of Honor, complete with a detailed after-action report. But that nomination was never acknowledged. 6 months later, the officer received back the envelope stamped, "Mission does not exist, nomination void." No explanation, no follow-up. Operation Revenant officially became something that never happened. And Eldon, who had led his comrades through a night of death, was reduced to an unbadged old man, with no paperwork, no witnesses. Since then, he never spoke of it again. Because when you survive something your entire country denies, you have only 2 choices: scream in vain or remain silent until someone dares to look you in the eye and believe. Dear viewers, please relax a moment, or grab a glass of water, then continue listening. The story still holds surprises. Comment 1 if you enjoyed this tale, so we know you're still with us. Eldon returned to Montana on an autumn afternoon. No one was waiting for him at the station. No nameplate, no welcoming embrace, no questions about where he'd been. He stepped off the bus like a stranger in the very state where he was born. No uniform, no insignia, no discharge papers. Just a gaunt figure, a faded backpack, and a man who had walked through hell yet no one knew. His wife had passed away years before. They had no children. The old neighbors had either moved away or gone to their graves. There was no one for him to recount his story to. No one to remind him of a chapter of his life. The only people who had ever known him were dead or forced to forget. With no army, no unit, Eldon became an unfinished sketch. He rented a small room on the outskirts of town and drew a basic pension, because on paper he was merely a logistics clerk. Sometimes he took odd jobs at the old mill, stacking wood or unloading freight, but his hands once deft at removing bomb pins now trembled as he lifted a crate of water. At the farmer's market, people saw him as a slightly odd old man dressed in ragged clothes, muttering to himself, always wearing a tattered cap, and forever wrapping that plaid scarf around his neck, regardless of the weather. They didn't know that the scarf had once been soaked with blood, used to bind wounds, and held a soul from drifting away. It had belonged to the youngest soldier on the team, a 22-year-old kid, the only one who ever called Eldon uncle instead of boss. They had planned to return together, buy a house north of Bozeman, and plant apple trees. But those plans ended in Eldon's hands when the kid bled out because the medevac helicopter was 10 minutes late. Eldon didn't cry that day. He simply removed the scarf from the boy's neck, folded it, and tucked it into his own breast pocket, never to leave his side again. Afterward, Eldon struggled to survive. He drank just enough to sleep. He spoke to the shopkeeper, to the stray cat at the end of the street, to the shadows at night. Sometimes he talked about Afghanistan, about minefields, the fog-shrouded nights, the commander's fall. But when he spoke, people nodded politely, then laughed as if listening to an old man describing UFOs or ghosts. One boy even said, "Sir, that tattoo on your arm looks like one of those fake symbols from the movies." And so Eldon fell silent. He stopped talking not because he had nothing to say, but because no one truly wanted to listen. No one would believe that sometimes the most important things don't exist on paper. No one thought that truth could be erased by a single decision. He began to withdraw. No more veterans meetings, no more benefit applications, no responses to letters from the department. He lived quietly, as if paying off an invisible debt someone forgot to record. The plaid scarf became the sole reminder that he had once existed in a place and time where life was measured not by rank or medals, but by each step set down without triggering an explosion. Some nights, Eldon sat on his porch, the scarf in his hand pressed against his face as if in prayer. There was no one to talk to, but also no one to question him. He lived between two extremes, a world that didn't know he existed, and a world he no longer wished to remember. And that was the deepest wound, not the bullet through his shoulder, not the grenade shrapnel in his hip, but the sense that a lifetime's honor could be wiped away by 2 words, does not exist. No name tag to remove, no comrades to bid farewell. Eldon wasn't discharged, he was erased. And when a man is wiped from the system yet still lives, he is no longer a veteran, he is just a blot of ink no one dares to read again. Chris Landon returned to the cafe the next morning. He entered not with curiosity, but with solemn purpose. No skepticism remained. No hesitation. In his hand was his phone. In his mind, a decision. This time, he was not there to verify. He was there to do what should perhaps have been done years ago. Eldon sat in his usual corner, his coffee cup half empty, his gaze quietly fixed on the window where the sunlight just reached to illuminate the faint veins on his hand. Chris approached, but did not sit. He stood beside him, leaned down slightly, and spoke low enough for only the 2 of them to hear. His voice did not tremble, but carried a natural gravity. "May I tell that story for you?" Eldon did not answer immediately. He did not turn his head. He simply tightened his grip on the edge of the plaid scarf around his neck, then looked up and met the young soldier's eyes. No words. No emphatic nod. Only a slight, very slow nod, as if opening a door long locked from the incident out of pleading, but because at last someone had learned the right knock. That afternoon, Chris began recording the video. He used no effects. No background music. Nothing ornate. Just a 3-minute clip in which he recounted the moment he saw Eldon's tattoo, spoke of the salute, and shared what little he knew of Operation Revenant. He did not disclose details. He did not name names. But in his voice was something the internet's AI could never manufacture: truth. He posted it to a small forum for special operations veterans. That evening, it received a few hundred views. By the next morning, a few thousand. By the end of the third day, it surpassed 1 million. And from there, nothing ever stopped. Comments poured in. Not hollow emojis or empty respect messages, but long postings of jumbled memories, apologies, and names once crossed off death lists in blood. A veteran from El Paso wrote, "I'd heard of that man. They called him the Ghost in Helmand. No one knew his name, but everyone knew he pulled 3 men out of that valley without orders." Another, who had served in logistics in Kandahar, confirmed, "I once saw that symbol on an ammo box being passed around. When I asked, I was told to forget it immediately. Now I understand why." And then there were those who had remained silent because they were ordered to now beginning to write, not recounting details. Just lines like, "I can't confirm, but I know that man wasn't lying." Fragments of memory seeping out like water through coarse fabric slowly, but unstoppable. By Friday, the Missoula City Council had heard the news. By the 10th day, a modest but solemn ceremony was held, small, unassuming, yet dignified enough for those who knew to bow their heads when appropriate. Eldon was invited onto a small stage erected before the city library. Before him sat hundreds young and old, most of whom had never heard his name a week prior. Yet they were there, not out of curiosity, but out of obligation. He wore no uniform, only an old shirt, faded khakis, and his neatly wrapped plaid scarf. In his hand he held a replica Medal of Honor, not an official government award, but a copy designed and signed by more than 20 special operations veterans who had never met him, yet shared the same silence. They presented him with a small dossier containing summary affidavits, independent confirmations from multiple individuals, and an open letter handwritten under the heading, "From those who were never permitted to call you comrade but have always regarded you as one." Eldon did not speak. He simply clenched the scarf in his hand. His eyes were not red, but no longer dry. He looked down at the front row, where an empty chair had been set aside, a small gesture, but one everyone understood. The young soldier was still present, no name needed. And in that moment, without fireworks, without speeches, without a flag draped over his shoulder sit, was the most genuine act of recognition, belated yet heartfelt. For Eldon Parrish, it was not forgiveness. It was the first time in his life that his silence was no longer mistaken. After that ceremony, Eldon no longer appeared at the cafe. No one saw him walk in, and the gentle chime of the doorbell at 7:12 a.m. was gone. The corner table he once warmed with his quiet presence now stood cold. Some said he had moved into the veterans' nursing home south of town. Others claimed he went to live with his only surviving cousin in the Bitterroot Mountains. But in truth, no one knew for sure, and no one asked further. For Eldon, disappearing was never an end. It was merely another way to survive. Only one fact remained clear: the table where he had sat would never be cleared away. The owner made no announcement. No reserved sign was posted. She simply affixed a small brass plaque to the edge of the table, subtle enough not to draw attention, yet sturdy enough to deter anyone from sitting. Etched upon it were the only words, "Eldon Parrish's chair." He fought for freedom, demanding nothing in return. No flourish, no exaltation, yet it needed nothing more. Each visitor understood in their own way. Some paused for a moment, some bowed their heads, some lightly touched the table's edge in silent salute. Gradually, that chair became part of the café as decor, but as a necessary empty space, reminding all that one need not bear a name to be worthy of remembrance. 1 year later, on the very anniversary of the day Chris Landon first saw Eldon's tattoo, a small monument was erected in Missoula's Central Park. No ribbon cutting, no speeches, no fanfare. Only a group of veterans in simple jackets gathered quietly in the morning mist. The monument bore no human likeness, no inscribed names. It was merely a polished black stone, crisply cut, engraved with the arrow piercing 2 interlocking circles, the symbol which, thanks to Eldon, was no longer a suppressed mystery, but a reminder of something that once existed, not forgotten for its insignificance, but buried for being inconvenient to acknowledge. The entire cost of the monument came from the veteran community, those who had served in silence, those who had heard of the nameless soldier in Helmand, those who had shared Chris's video with the curt caption, "He needs no applause, only justice." That monument draws no tourists. It does not appear on city maps, yet every soldier who passes pauses. Some place a hand on the stone, some remove their cap. Some sit quietly on the opposite bench, sipping cold coffee. No one cries, no one tells stories. But in that space, something speaks more clearly than any written oration ever could. Beneath the symbol, there was no date, only a single line carved deep yet left unpainted, so you must lean in close to read. Some live their whole lives as shadows, only so that one day the light of truth may reveal them. That was not a farewell, it was a pledge. And from that moment on, no one ever referred to Eldon Parrish as the old man in the corner again. To those who had seen him, heard of him, or understood what he carried, he became the witness to a truth long buried, and the one who gave the world a chance to wipe it clean. The chair remains untouched. His plaid scarf is preserved under glass behind the counter. And that embleman arrow piercing two circles ceased to be an anonymous tattoo. It is memory, symbol, the final echo of warriors who chose silence over acclaim. And for those in the know, the mere sight of that empty chair is enough. Eldon Parrish's story is not just about a forgotten soldier. It is about how truth, no matter how deeply buried, can find its way back into the light. It reminds us that honor is not measured by medals or paperwork, but by the quiet steadfastness of each day. That sometimes an unjudging gaze or a belated acknowledgement can become the salve that heals a lifetime. If you have ever known someone like Eldon, someone who sacrificed in silence without asking for anything, please leave a comment below. Share this story with a veteran, a father, or a friend who has walked through pain without speaking a word. And if this story has touched you, please like, subscribe, and let me know where you're watching from. Because sometimes, a community that listens together is enough to ensure that those like Eldon no longer walk in darkness.